co-founded 3 companies, have sold 3 companies, and then was brought in as CEO of Twitter. And so again, I'm just going to kind of hop around and piecemeal some lessons learned and things that I think are really important that I get continued questions about time and time again. I think the first lesson I want to point out, and again I'm just going to hop around, but that was important to us at FeedBurner, and that has been really important to Twitter, and it's not an obvious lesson, is that having a company voice is a competitive advantage. So anyone who's familiar with Woot probably knows that Woot is a deal of the day site, and there are thousands of deal of the day sites. But people love Woot so much because their company voice, the way they describe their deals of the day, is authentic. It's sometimes raunchy. It's funny. If you want to read the ultimate company voice internal, blog post, go read the Woot CEO's blog post when they were acquired by Amazon. If you haven't read it, it's an absolute must-read. Flickr was kind of the company that FeedBurner looked to when we kind of came to this realization that one of the reasons people were attracted to Flickr wasn't just the technology, but in Flickr's early blog posts, it just had a tone. It had a tone of voice and a way of speaking. And you always knew you could kind of hear Stuart Butterfield or Katerina in the back of your mind when you were reading their posts. And it was compelling, and it just kind of drew you to the service. And that, coupled with the technology, was just a thing that made you like the company, right? So at FeedBurner, our 404 error page was just a big page that said "there is no spoon," right? And so some people knew the reference, and some people didn't. And I don't even frankly know what the reference is, but a couple of our designers built it, and I said, "What does that mean?" They said, "Don't worry, we play to the top of the room." So, thus backhandedly pointing out I have a lowbrow sense of entertainment. And that's the kind of thing that makes people like the company, right? They root for you, like the people who get it are drawn into it. And our blog posts would have these really obtuse and obscure references to things that we knew only 0.5% of the people would get, but people loved that. And Twitter's kind of the same way. So when we made our recruiting video, and when we made our video for the new Twitter UI, we didn't just make the video to be, here are the jobs that are available, the recruiting video, for example, here are the jobs that are available on Twitter. We made a video that was based on the movie Rushmore, and it was very much like the opening to the movie Rushmore, and the people who got that were compelled by it, right? We got lots and lots of applications from highly qualified people, even though nothing in the video says anything really about what kind of people we're looking for. You just kind of get the kind of people we're looking for by watching the video. And similarly with the new Twitter, when we made the video for new Twitter, there's only about 20 seconds of the video, of the 2-minute, I think, video, that show the new interface, but it pulls you in because it's very Twitter-y, right? It's about people and the things that this couple and this guy going on a date and looking to Twitter for what he's going to find on the date, and then posting the twit pic of one of the things they do on the date. But it all kind of builds up to that, and it just feels very Twitter-y, and it's become one of the most highly viewed videos on YouTube, even though, like I said, it's essentially just a video of a new user interface for a website. So having a company voice and having an authentic company voice can be a real competitive advantage. I think far too often people just ignore that and kind of do things like, we're excited to announce. Well, everyone's excited to announce when they announce something, right? So say something silly like, with great trepidation and yet just a little bit of, delight that we announce, or something, interesting and compelling and different. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out as a lesson learned. And again, I don't really remember all the things I wrote down, so I'm just going to go back to them. Term sheets. I told you I was going to hop around a lot. So entrepreneurs, and so the VCs will hear the thing I'm about to say and go, yeah, but I'll explain what I'm talking about. Entrepreneurs, when you're pitching your company, and let's all be so lucky to have multiple term sheets coming in, or a couple term sheets coming in when we're pitching our company and trying to raise money. Way too often, I see first-time entrepreneurs optimize for valuation, and that's the point where I thought that most of the VCs were like, right on. right? So entrepreneurs think, they look at the valuation and go, oh, this valuation is higher than this one, so this is a better term sheet, right? What I optimize for as an entrepreneur is I optimize for a clean term sheet, right? So everything from non-cumulative dividends with a low dividend rate to not participating preferred, but just 1x, right? Converts to common on any liquidation event. And you can go on and on and on through the set of terms. But I always look for clean term sheets over optimizing for valuation. Okay? And there are all sorts of reasons for that. Like one of the things that entrepreneurs will do is they'll look at the valuation number, the pre-money valuation number, and that number will get stuck in their head. But other things like participation preference or participating preferred or participation multiple or warrants or the amount of post-money option pool that has to be created, those all factor into the valuation, right? But you see this number and they go, well, that's 4 and that's 5, so I'm going to really try to work on this one that says 5, even though it's got more janky stuff in it. So again, I think you'll hear this from lots of multiple-time entrepreneurs. Try to optimize for a clean term sheet, not optimize for valuation. Okay, that's that. Oh, good. This is one of my favorite ones. And this is another good one for both companies I've started previously and now Twitter. And I call it no exit. So when I was at FeedBurner, I would speak to, I'd go to business schools and speak to business school classes of entrepreneurs. And I'd talk for a while, and at the end of the talk, they would, someone would inevitably raise their hand and say, what's your exit strategy? And the Twitter equivalent of that is whenever I'm on like Bloomberg TV or CNBC now, and I talk for a while, the person in the studio eventually says, when's the IPO? And my answer now is that at Twitter is the same as it was at FeedBurner, and the Twitter answer is, we never talk about an IPO. And then the person in the studio eventually goes, oh, come on, like we talk about it every day. We don't ever talk about an IPO at Twitter. And the question when I would get it at FeedBurner, what's your exit strategy? The way I would answer that is, I don't have an exit strategy, I have an entrance strategy, right? So and what I mean by that is, Bambi kind of pointed this out earlier when she talked about passion and an excitement for what you do. And the video capture of Vinod behind me, had vision is kind of bumbling around, right? So what I mean by we don't have an exit strategy, we had an entrance strategy. At FeedBurner, we always thought only about how are we going to try to enter this market and do really well in this market and capture a large portion of this market. And we wrote something down at FeedBurner that we always look back to, and it was make a map of how you want to grow the business, not how you want to, what you want to have happen to the company, right? So make a map of how you want to grow the business, not what you want to have happen to the company. Way too often you see people say things like, well, I think if we do this and we do this, then Yahoo or Google is an acquirer. Like that's just a moronic way to go through life. You can't live your life like that. There's no way to predict what's going to happen to your business. When we started FeedBurner, like a couple months after we started FeedBurner, Google launched this thing called AdSense for Feeds, right? And we just, they did that, and then we had to zigzag in another direction and do something else. So you're constantly kind of trying to play around with where you're going to go, where you're going to head, and trying to find a market and then dive into that market. And if you're not passionate about what you're doing, and you're trying to think about, well, gosh, if we do that new thing, we might not be able to sell it to Yahoo, then you're just going to, you're going to end up nowhere. It's no fun. You have a high likelihood of not having, the chances of you selling to the company you predict you want to sell to when you start your business are next to 0, right? So you just have to kind of go forward, and as Vinod says, bumble around. David Hornick refers to finding your business model as a lot like going to the eye doctor, more like this or like this, B or C, C or D, C or B, right? And you just kind of keep going until you find an alley that doesn't have a dead end in it. And if you're not passionate about what you're doing and you're just trying to optimize for the end instead of going on the journey and seeing where it leads you, not knowing what the outcome's going to be, you're going to have a suboptimal result and probably fail, right? So I think that's probably the biggest lesson is you just can't worry about that stuff. You just have to work on the assumption that you're either the business will either go well and you'll grow your market and you'll therefore be successful, or it won't work and you can go do something else. Okay, next one I remember. I don't even have to look at it. And it's optimized for the long-term value of the platform you're building or the architecture or the service you're building, don't maximize short-term revenues. A mistake that I made in one of my first companies was we were headed down a direction, and we were very focused, and we had a kind of goal we wanted to get to 6 months down the road. And along came a company that said to us, you know, we'll pay you like $250,000 if you guys do this other thing. That wasn't where we were going in 6 months. And at the time to us, that was just a truckload of money, and still is a truckload of money to a lot of entrepreneurs getting started for their first customer. And we said, great. And then we went over and did this other thing. So what did that end up doing? It distracted us from what we wanted to, where we really wanted to go. We then ended up having this product that had a customer that was using it for one very specific thing that we couldn't get other customers to use it for. So then when we went back to doing what we wanted to do, we were about 3 months behind and had another kind of forked product in the market that we had to support for a while, and it leads to suboptimal results, right? So always think about what's the long-term value of what I'm doing, not trying to optimize for short-term revenues, or especially you see that one first customer that's willing to pay you to do X. If you just don't do what you want to do, but do it a little bit differently, it's hard to turn that down, but it's usually important to turn that down and go do what you planned on doing in the first place, especially if this other thing that's a little bit different isn't repeatable. Contrary to one that people say frequently, you hear launch early and often. I say launch late to launch often. So what do I mean by that? At FeedBurner, our original idea was, hey, let's provide statistics for RSS feeds so that publishers can actually see where their feeds are going, because as content becomes more and more distributed, it's going to be important for publishers to understand where their data is going and understand how to manage that data in syndication. That was our hypothesis. Now, we could have gone and built a point solution that only provided statistics for RSS feed distribution. But instead, we decided, let's build an extensible architecture for managing feeds and syndication, because there might be lots and lots of other things that we can't even imagine yet that we'll want to do with feeds and syndication. Now we'll start by providing this analytics dashboard, but let's first build this extensible architecture, and then we'll build an analytics dashboard on top of that, and then we'll have a platform on which we can innovate. So we did that. It took us a lot longer than it would have taken us to build an analytics dashboard for RSS feeds. But lo and behold, and I remember when my very first pitch was to Andrew Anker, who is now at 6 Apart, but was at August Capital at the time with David Hornick. And he said, well, this is interesting, but like, what else are you guys going to do besides RSS feed stats? And we said, well, we think as content syndication becomes more and more important, there are going to be more and more interesting tools that publishers are going to want in syndication. And Andrew's reasonable question was, well, like what? And our answer was, we don't know. But we think there will be some, probably a lot. And lo and behold, there were a lot. So as an example, about a year after we launched FeedBurner, Apple came out and said, hey, if you want to syndicate podcasts into iTunes, here's a set of RSS extensions that you can put in your feed, and it'll be easy to get your podcast into iTunes. And then people had to scramble and figure out how to manually add this iTunes XML to their RSS feeds. And we had a very easy capability to add the iTunes extensions to people's RSS feeds, because we had built an extensible architecture, so it made it very easy for us to add that into what we were already doing. So again, it took us 9 months to launch the first thing, when it could have taken us 2 months, but when it came time to do the iTunes extensions, we did it in a week, instead of having to now go code a whole thing just to manage iTunes extensions, right? And then Apple did us another favor, and like 3 weeks later said, actually, we don't like those iTunes extensions, we're changing them again, and people just kind of said, oh my God, the heck with it, just use FeedBurner to manage all this stuff. And then we added monetization and started allowing publishers to kind of staple their own ads into the feed so they can make money on their content and syndication, and on and on and on, right? There ended up being like 20, 30, 40 capabilities we were able to add to the product very, very quickly. So that's what I mean by launch late to launch often. I think that's something that kind of gets entrepreneurs a lot these days. I mean, Twitter, frankly, as everyone at Twitter will tell you, was built, they built the product, not this extensible architecture. It's no surprise that services had scalability issues over the years. And so then you have to go refactor on the fly, and that's a lot harder if you haven't built out an extensible architecture to begin with, right? You have to refactor components one at a time and then encapsulate them as you're going, as you're growing, and it's much, much harder to do. So that's what I mean by launch late to launch often. Now, that can sometimes be, what I don't want you to take that as is we gotta wait till it's perfect to launch it. That's not what I mean by that. What I mean is build out an extensible architecture and then iterate very, very quickly on it. Roll new things out, test them. If they don't work, get rid of them, right? The other mistake you'll make is people will hear launch late to launch often and think, we gotta wait till this thing is just right and then we'll roll it out. I think that's another big mistake companies will make. You'll frequently see multiple companies in the same market, and the one who wins is the one that iterates quickly, and the one who loses is the one that always kind of thinks, okay, it's a year later, and now here's the big version 2, and then they kind of lob this huge, giant set of changes all at once out into the market, and half of it works, half of it doesn't. The company that iterates quickly is usually much more successful. Okay, so launch late to launch often. This is one of the, I'm stealing this one from Mike Cassidy. Mike Cassidy is at Google now. He's a very successful serial entrepreneur here in the Valley. I think he started Direct Hit, sold that. Xfire, to sort of a video game chat service. He sold to Viacom, I believe. And then Ruba, which is a travel search service that he sold to Google, and he's at Google now. So Mike is, and he's a great guy, and a very successful serial entrepreneur in the Valley here. His rule number 1 for entrepreneurs, and it's also one of my rules, but not my rule number 1, is don't revisit decisions that you make as a team or as a company. And what he means by that is, you can argue with me, and I want you to argue with me a lot if you would disagree with me while we're trying to come to a decision. And we should have, open and vocal debate about whatever decision we're going to make. But once we make that decision, everyone's on board with it, and we never talk, we never revisit it. We don't, if it doesn't work, we don't say behind anyone else's back, I actually thought that was a bad idea, but we decided to do it, so you never do that. You never revisit decisions, and you never tell the team, it turned out that probably wasn't the right thing to do. What we should have done, the way to deal with that is, you make decisions, you move forward, and then if you have to do something else later on, you do something else later on. The reason you don't revisit decisions is because, especially as a leader of a company, what you're doing a lot of the time as a leader of the company is running out on the high dive and telling everybody behind you, like, let's go, come on, we're going to jump into this pool. And if you start revisiting decisions, about the 5th time you go, let's go, we're going to jump into this pool, the team will get about halfway out onto the diving board and then go, actually, remember last time we found out later that the pool wasn't very deep. And then remember, there was at one time we found out later, we remember later it was cold. And then actually, remember last time we found out later on it was higher than we thought it was, right? And it starts to get harder and harder and harder to get everyone to go, let's go, because people start saying, well, last couple times we've made these decisions, we've realized they weren't really the right thing, so maybe we should talk about this one a lot more and make sure we really, right? And it starts to get harder and harder and harder to execute, and the pace of execution slows down, and people lose confidence in the decisions that are being made. It's much easier to just iterate, fail, and move on. Okay? And I think that was it. Might have 1 or 2 more. Oh, yeah. So this one is, this is more of a lesson for successful entrepreneurs. And the lesson is, you're like only as good as what you did the last time, right? So, and I'll just tell this quick story. So this buddy of mine, John Kaplan, is a high-tech entrepreneur in New York. And John was one of the first folks at About.com, and now has a company called Open Sky that I think Highland funded. But between those two things, he went and became CEO of Ford Models, the Ford Model Agency in New York. And he ran that for a bunch of years and recently sold it. And he would go to these parties with all these models, and these models would see him on the street, and John, and hug him, and and oh my God, John, and see him at restaurants and do the same thing to him. And he said, it's been 3 months since I left Ford Models, and when I walk down Fifth Avenue now and I see these people, they look past me like I'm not even there. And he said, and I realized that I thought I was somebody, but I'm really just John Kaplan. So I think that's really an important lesson for successful entrepreneurs. You start to believe your own hype. Like, I did this thing. It was awesome. I'm really smart. Right? And sometimes it's just success bias. Like, you did this thing, it worked, you now think of this thing as a rule you should tell everybody else, right? So I think it's important, even when you're successful, to realize, hey, the next time might be a complete disaster, and I need to remember that when I'm thinking about all the relationships I have with other people. All right, that's it, I think.